Hey, what's up, people? Welcome to my review and in depth analysis of Timothy Zahn's Star Wars novel, Vision of the Future. Now, I thought Vision of the Future was a decent read. Timothy Zahn continues to be one of the greatest Star Wars authors in the expanded universe, and I really appreciate his level of detail. When you read a Timothy Zahn Star Wars novel, you really feel like he is the one that is taking this material very serious. I put him in the same league as James Luceno. Timothy Zahn takes the material very seriously. Every sentence, every detail of the technology, of the political machinations that are going on in the Star Wars galaxy. I also love how he approaches the original trilogy characters. He treats Han Solo, Luke, and Leia, and Lando with the utmost respect. He really knows how to continue that continuity as far as the themes and the tone of the original trilogy. He nails it without a question. And his new characters, Mara Jade and Talon Card, they continue to be well fleshed out and beloved characters. I really appreciate it. And the overall ending to this story, which is basically the sequel and conclusion to Spectre of the Past, it's very satisfying. It was a slow build up, but it is worth the wait. It is worth your patience. And again, I think it's worth your patience because I am appreciating the level of detail that Timothy Zahn puts into this novel. He's not just trying to rush through the story, he's trying to paint a picture of the Star Wars galaxy. He's trying to bring you there in the novelized format, and he does an outstanding job at doing so. I really appreciated how Timothy Zahn treated the clones in this novel. It's really, you have to remember that this book came out at a time when the prequels weren't even a thought necessarily. The prequels did not exist. So, with that in mind, reading how Timothy Zahn approaches clones in the Star Wars galaxy, I love his approach. He treated the material very seriously, whether it's technology or the science of the world or the military strategies. He nails it. It's Timothy Zahn's greatest strength. Now, despite all these positive qualities to this book, there are some negative qualities. They're very few. And just like I mentioned in the Spectre of the Past review and in depth analysis, Timothy Zahn's greatest weakness is that he could come across a little superfluous. And what I mean by that is things can get convoluted at times, full overblown with some of the details. And that happens at certain points in this novel. Another weakness to this novel, in contrast to Spectre of the Past, is that I feel like there's too many characters. We spend too much time away from the main characters such as Luke and Mara Jade, and we focus on characters that really are not that interesting. And I'm particularly talking about these Mistral assassin shadow guard characters. There's two of them in this novel. We have Shada or Shada, whatever the hell her name is, and then another one called Caroli or whatever. And it's just, I really feel like both characters cancel each other out because ultimately they remind me too much of Mara Jade. Their personalities are way too similar. So it's like having three Mara Jade characters within the same novel. And then on top of this, we have this subplot involving Wedge and Coron going after this saboteur, this guy named Navet. And it was just an extremely uninteresting story or subplot. And maybe it wouldn't have been that uninteresting, but Timothy Zahn focuses way too much time on this subplot. It just dragged on the level of detail in regards to what's going on and the just too much time spent on these scenes that at the end of the day didn't feel that significant as far as character. Yes, the plot to sabotage the shields on the Bothan planet are very important. It's very important. But just this whole dwelling on the character Naved, and it was just boring as hell. So those are the few weaknesses to this novel. But other than that, it was a great read. It was fascinating. It was awesome to see the clone of Thrawn be destroyed by Luke and Mara on the Hand of Thrawn fortress. All that stuff was great. And it was specifically awesome to see Admiral Palion finally get those Imperials that were double crossing him. I'm talking about Disra and Tierce. That was awesome. I was really, really, really looking forward to that. And the build up towards that confrontation was awesome. So, without further ado, let's begin this review and in depth analysis of Timothy Zahn's Star Wars novel, Vision of the Future. So, our story begins with Admiral Pelion. So, he just repulsed an attack by an unidentified force. As the reader, you know that this force was sent by Moff Disra and Tierce in order to instigate this whole conflict between the New Republic and the Empire in order to keep the conflict going because Palion wants peace with New Republic. He wants peace with the New Republic. He's pursuing that, and certain Moffs and other Imperials within the Empire don't like that idea. They want to bring the Empire back to its glory days, back when Palpatine was around, or even Grand Admiral Thrawn. So, Admiral Pelion decides to remain in orbit over Pestine until they know for certain whether the New Republic General Bel Iblis received his message for a peace proposal, and he decides to wait 2 more weeks. Now, while this is going down, aboard the Relentless, Moff Disra is contacted by the pirate leader named Zothip after losing to the New Republic. Now, Disra is pissed off about this. And Disra, he basically has accompanied a con man known as Flim, who is pretending to be Grand Admiral Thrawn, and Major Tierce, who is a former Royal Guardsman, to the Kroktar system. And it's basically a much deeper incursion into the New Republic than he is comfortable with. And the Relentless at this moment is basically flagged down by Lord Superior Bosmihi, who basically wants to petition for his planet to be integrated into the Empire. And he wants to do this after hearing about Thrawn's return. And just be mindful that Grand Admiral Thrawn, he ain't back. It's all the con man known as Flim, who's pretending to be Grand Admiral Thrawn. Now, Flim, as Thrawn, appoints Disra to handle the negotiation with this guy. Now, Disra suspects that Tierce is up to something. And Tierce says that while he was serving aboard the Chimera during the real Grand Admiral Thrawn's campaign against the New Republic, Thrawn mentioned the Hand of Thrawn as key to the Empire's ultimate and total victory against the New Republic. But at this point in the story, they don't really know what the Hand of Thrawn truly is. So we also learn about a little bit of Thrawn's background. So the Admonitor commanding officer known as Park Nyres basically found Thrawn in the unknown regions and was assigned to Grand Admiral Thrawn's mapping expedition in the unknown region. And mysteriously, commanding officer Park Nyres, or Nyres, whatever the hell his name is, he never came back. You gotta forgive me, I'm bad with these names. I'm always gonna say that, so I apologize. So the guy that went on the mapping expedition with Thrawn in the unknown regions, he never came back. So it was very interesting to touch on some of Thrawn's background because a little bit of this ties into another prequel novel that Thrawn wrote called Outbound Flight. And when I say prequel, I mean like a prequel to his Thrawn trilogy. So I wasn't the biggest fan of that book. However, all the aspects involving Thrawn's origin were fascinating in that book. Um, the only reason I didn't really like that book was because of how they handled the character Jorah Seaboth. If you're interested, check out that review. But moving on, we also learn that the Bastion copy of the Kamas document has been altered. Now, what is the Kamas document? It is basically a document that details who was responsible for this terrible genocidal incident that took place on the planet Kamas. And allegedly, it's basically the Bothans who are responsible for this. So certain people feel like the Bothans are responsible for the Kamas massacre, and since this is all being brought up again after many years of it happening, it's basically reigniting all these resentments between planets and certain allegiances and all that. And this is very pivotal to basically instigating a conflict within the New Republic. So the central goal of Tears and Disra is to create a civil war within the New Republic using this Kamas document or the incidents that were involved in the destruction of Kamas in order to take advantage, in order to bring the Empire back to its glory days. So while this is going down, Talon Card and Shada Dukal, a former Mistral Shadow Guard assassin, are out looking for George Cardass, who may have a copy of the Kamas document. And George Cardass, he's a big underworld boss who values information. And it turns out that George is on the planet Exocron. Now, another interesting detail about this character, George Cardass, is how he was introduced in the Outbound Flight novel. Or actually, no, he was introduced here because if we talk about the chronology of when Timothy Zahn wrote his story, he was introduced here initially, but as far as chronologically, as far as narrative, he's introduced in Outbound Flight, and he was very important as far as how the events went down in that novel involving Thrawn, first being discovered by the Star Wars Galaxy characters. In fact, Thrawn kind of had him as a hostage on his ship. He kind of welcomed George and his fellow smugglers, if I remember correctly, into his little circle onto his ship. Basically, the approach was this: you are my guest, but you're not allowed to leave. That's one thing I remember that Thrawn did to George and his fellow crew members. And he basically used George Cardass as a way to familiarize himself with the Star Wars galaxy because you have to remember he's a Chiss from the unknown regions. And he basically had George as an underling but forced him there. And I don't necessarily remember what happened. I have to go back and read that book again or listen to the in depth analysis again. But another interesting thing is that George Cardass, during that Outbound Flight novel, he wasn't what he is being described as in this novel, in Vision of the Future, because here our characters, Talon Card and Shada, are approaching him as this infamous big underworld boss who is dangerous and needs to be feared. So when I hear that and contrast him with how he was depicted in Outbound Flight, it's very interesting because George was nothing like that in Outbound Flight. In fact, he came across as anything but this big, ruthless underworld boss character. So, at this point in the story, if you're reading the narrative in chronological order, it's very interesting. You want to see, you want to find out what happened to George Cardis. How did he become this big, ruthless underworld boss that Talon Card is describing? Now, another important detail that goes down at this point in the novel is that Palion learns that Thrawn has returned, and he is very suspicious of this because you have to remember he was there when Thrawn was killed, when his throat got cut. He was there, he saw it. So for him to learn that Thrawn is back is very suspicious. Yet at the same time, simultaneously, he doesn't put it past Thrawn. He knows that Thrawn is a clever man. So he doesn't rule out 100% that Thrawn could not return. He believes that there is a possibility. However, he is very doubtful. And just like Palion, he wants to investigate further before jumping to conclusions and things of that nature. Now, another important detail at this point in the novel is that Leia is to be assassinated. Leia and Han are ultimately saved by Imperial clones of a character called Zuntir Fel, who is basically a famous former Imperial pilot and Rogue Squadron pilot, which were created by Thrawn. So these clones of Suntar Fel were created by Thrawn. And basically, they inform Leia and Han that they are going to help them find the Bothans responsible for the Kamas massacre. So one important detail that I really found interesting was just how Thrawn was just this mastermind, this ultimate strategist, how he was doing all these things and putting all these plots into motion that were to survive, even if he were to die. So even if he were to die, his plots would still be moving forward, and I really find that to be fascinating. Now, while this is going down, Diamalan Senator and Lando Calrissian are taken aboard Dorja's ship, the Relentless, in order to see, quote unquote, Admiral Thrawn, who is really the con man Flim. Now, this is important because Lando and the Senator are first hand witnesses to Thrawn's return. And the whole purpose of this sequence was so that Lando and the Senator can spread word throughout the New Republic that Admiral Thrawn is indeed back to lead the Empire to victory. So, if they spread this, this is going to cause more panic and more chaos. While this whole Kamas document or this Kamas massacre has been brought again to the forefront of New Republic politics, and the New Republic's on the brink of the Civil War, all this is just going to weaken the New Republic. Now, so far, this novel has been great. It's been very captivating, well written, and almost nearly every aspect of the story I've been fully engrossed with. I've been really engaged. However, as I stated in the introduction, this subplot involving Wedge and Koron going after this Navet character on Bathawi is extremely underwhelming and boring. So I'm just going to knock it all out right here instead of spreading it out throughout this review and in-depth analysis. So basically, Wedge and Koron are after this character named Navet on Bathawi. And Navet is part of a Vengeance Cell, which is an elite strike team of Imperial agents. And his unit is responsible for instigating anti-Bothan operations. And this can be exemplified through sabotage and causing havoc within protests and things like this. And the whole goal is to increase tensions and to allow the Battle of Bathawi to commence, which is all part of Disra's plan to stabilize the New Republic, cause civil war within the New Republic, and he's doing this by basically planting evidence that the Bothans were solely responsible for the Kamas firestorm, which led to this huge genocidal incident. Now, the bore and all that right there sounds very interesting. And that's the point. The point is this paragraph that I just spoke to you is very interesting. However, the way it's executed, it just goes on pages and pages and pages and pages. And what makes it boring is these discussions going back and forth between Wedge and Coron, and then back and forth between Navet and his men, and then back and forth between Wedge and Coron and this old woman that's helping him out, and how she basically is kind of like teasing Navet as far as trying to trick him and informing him that she is well aware of his plots and things like that. And it's just not interesting whatsoever. So Navet, he basically has to destroy the Bothan shield generator. And the way he does this is by using metalmite bombs on lizards or something like that. I mean, it's just really, really just superfluous in its execution, and it's extremely boring. And like I said, if you summarize it like I just did, it comes across as interesting, but it just goes on for way too long. And it's just uninteresting in its execution. And again, it's like I said in the introduction to this review, these characters are not interesting to me whatsoever. I've never been the biggest fan of Wedge. I've never been the biggest fan of Coron. And now we have this villain, Navet, who is not even really one of the big villains. You know, Dizra and Tierce, they're the big villains. And Timothy Zahn gives so much attention to this Navet character, and I felt like it was unwarranted. This whole time I was reading this portion of the story, and all this time dwelling on Navet, I was just like, who is this guy? Why is he so important? To me, he's just another goon. He's just another henchman. But we're spending all this time with him like he's this big villain like Disra or Tierce or even Thrawn. And I just found it completely boring, and it just slowed the entire story down. This was the worst part of this novel. This whole Wedge and Coron going after Navet with the help of this old lady. Now, I don't even remember who this old lady was. I don't know if it was elaborated on, but I could care less. I really could care less. I don't care. And ultimately, what happens is Navet, he dies after a baby Mokran. I think that's those lizards blew up, and he died during the explosion. But ultimately, he was successful in disabling the Bothan shields, which helped basically ignite this brief civil war within the New Republic that goes down at the end of this novel. So all this stuff that I just talked about, it's sprinkled throughout the book, but I just want to knock it out right away and just talk about the worst part of this book. And yeah, I really found every single page dedicated to this subplot to be extremely boring. I felt like it could have been chopped down 80% and just it would have been more interesting. And most importantly, it wouldn't have detracted from all the other characters, all the more important and interesting characters' stories. And I'm talking about characters like Luke and Mara and Talon Card and Shada and Han and Leia. So yeah, that was the worst part of this book. Now, as this goes down, Leia learns that Pelion wants peace. And the way she discovers this is through Gent, who is basically this master hacker. He basically slices through the encryption of this transmission from the Imperials, and that is how he's able to learn that Palion wants peace, and Leia decides to use this knowledge to pursue that course of action because we all know Leia by now. We all know that even though she's ready to kick some ass, she ultimately would rather pursue an avenue of peace. So, in regards to George Cardass, we learned some background that wasn't really revealed. in the Outbound Flight novel. So this is really exclusive to this book. And this was really interesting stuff. And I love how it ties into this little detail that was in the Thrawn trilogy where Luke Skywalker found this beacon call, or it's kind of like a beacon. He found it on Dagobah. And it was a big mystery as to what this was, who put it there. Well, it's finally revealed what that's all about. So basically, during the Clone Wars, George was kidnapped by a dark Jedi and he disappeared with this dark Jedi on his ship. And basically, the Dark Jedi's beck and call for the Dark Jedi ship was found by Luke on Dagobah in the Thrawn trilogy. And ultimately, what had happened is that the Dark Jedi and George Cardas landed on Dagobah where Yoda was, right? So you have to remember that Yoda is on Dagobah during this time. And ultimately, a battle ensued between Yoda and this Dark Jedi, and Yoda was able to defeat this Dark Jedi. And I thought that was really interesting, and I'd actually pay some good money to see a book about this. I would love to read more about this battle between Yoda and this Dark Jedi. Now, Cardis's smuggler organization grew after this conflict, and things again become a little bit more mysterious as to where George Cardis is now, or his mentality. And you have to remember that they've been looking for him for many years. And Talon Card even reveals that right here. He says that he sent Mara Jade and Lando Calrissian to look for him this whole time, and that they never found him until now. They're able to figure out that he's on the planet Exocron. So that was really interesting stuff right there. Now, I have another small negative. It's nowhere near as bad as the Wedge and Coron and Navette in the old lady story, but I found this aspect of the story to again detract from the main plot, from the main characters, and it's involving another Mistral, another Shadow Guard Mistral. Besides Shada Dukal, this character is named Carolee Doolin. And I don't know why she was in this novel. I mean, you already have Shada or Shada, whatever the hell her name is. You already have her in this book. Why you need to introduce another one and spend time with her? And we have like whole chapters dedicated to this character. And I just can't for the life of me figure out why Timothy Zahn did this. Like, I do not think this was a smart decision. Again, it's nowhere near as boring as the Wedge and Coron story, but this just felt uninteresting. And the problem is, it's that Carolee and Shada have a similar personality to Mara Jade. And I really feel like because of that, these characters are not interesting. Because at this point, I'm already interested in Mara Jade. She was introduced to us a long time ago. So now we have these other two kick-ass female characters, and they have a similar character traits as Mara Jade, and I mean like the way they respond to things and their attitudes, and it's just too similar, and it's boring. It's just not interesting. Now, in regards to this Carolee character, her whole thing is that she's after Zothip, the pirate leader. And the reason why she's after this guy is for the slaughter on her home planet. So there was a big slaughter on her home planet, and she holds the pirate leader Zothip responsible. And ultimately, what happens is Carolee kills Zothip on Disra's ship, and she slaughters his men too. She's basically a kick-ass assassin. We get it. Is it interesting? No, it's not. It's boring. Now, later, and I'm talking way later, basically at the end of the novel, she kind of meets up again with Shada. So basically, they were kind of working together in the first book, and then Shada kind of didn't fulfill her duty, so she got exiled from the Mistral, and then she teamed up with Talon Card, and she does her own thing. And ultimately, what happens later at near the end of this novel, they cross paths again, and she reconciles with Shada about her allegiance to the Mistral. And Card kind of forces her to agree to stop hunting her, to stop hunting Shada, to leave her alone, and that's basically what happens. The end, as far as Carol Lee's story. I mean, you could have took it out of the book and it would have done nothing. It wouldn't have harmed the story in any shape, form, or fashion. It was completely unnecessary. Now, while this is going down, Admiral Paleon finally confronts Disra on his ship in regards to this whole notion of Grand Admiral Thrawn returning. He wants to know if it's true. And while Disra is gone or his back's turned or something along those lines, Paleon takes documents showing Disra's betrayal. And what I mean is he gathers evidence that he's been conspiring with the pirates and that he was behind the kidnapping of Colonel Vermel. So Paleon has the evidence and he's going to use this in order to bring Disra down. Now, Han and Lando Calrissian during this time journey into enemy territory on Bastion, which is basically the capital of the Empire at this point. And they go there to learn the truth of the Kamas document. They want to know if there's any evidence they could gather, just anything that could help them with the truth behind the incident that took place on Kamas decades ago. Now, the fake Admiral Thrawn gives Han and Lando a copy of the Kamas document at Bastion and basically tells them that Fela, who is basically one of the prominent Bothan leaders, was behind the riot that took place in the first novel and that he stole these sniper rifles that were used during that riot from a cache that belonged to the Empire. Now, obviously, the Kamas document that was given to Han and Lando is a fake, but they don't know that at this point in the story. And they are extremely suspicious as to the reasons why Thrawn would even give them something like this. Like, what's the reason? Now, when Talon Card and Shada finally find George on Exocron, he is initially introduced to us as this old, decrepit guy that has dementia. But it's all just him pretending. And at this time, there is this pirate attack that goes down on Exocron, and Card and Shada basically help repel the pirates. And again, it turns out that George was faking this whole time, and he basically used them to fight against the pirates. And they get really pissed off about this. Now, in regards to Mara Jade and Luke Skywalker, I mean, I've been blabbing on for 33 minutes and I haven't even talked about them. Well, you could say that this is kind of a negative in regards to this book, but it really isn't. But there's not much time spent with Mara and Luke. There's back and forth, yes, throughout the novel, but they are on the planet where the Hand of Thrawn is going down. And the Hand of Thrawn is basically Thrawn's fortress. And while they're there, they befriend the Quamke, which are basically aliens that communicate through the Force. And a lot of their story is about them infiltrating the fortress. And that's it for the most part until we get to the end when they actually infiltrate the fortress. But this whole time, it's just about them slowly getting in there. And again, character development between Mara and Luke. Because what ultimately happens by the end of this novel is they get married to one another. They fall in love. So that's what basically is going down between Mara and Luke. There's not a lot of big, huge plot details that span all over the Star Wars galaxy involving these two. No, they are stuck in this place together, and that's basically how this story with them goes throughout this book. And the reason for this is because we're developing character here. We're developing this romance between them. that is really well written because it's not a cheesy romance. It's not basically Anakin Skywalker and Padme and a lot of smooching. And it's not even Han and Leia with this bickering back and forth. Well, I know you really like me kind of thing. This is really a relationship, a romance built on respect for one another and how kind of how Mara and Luke complement one another. They're almost opposites, or one has the strength that the other is lacking. So it was really interesting to read this little subplot involving them. Now, Mara at this point basically flat out tells Luke that there was never any romance between her and Lando. And again, throughout the course of this book, Luke and Mara, they bond together, and it's revealed that Mara Jade, she doesn't want to fully commit to the Jedi to serve the galaxy 100% yet. So she's kind of conflicted about giving herself 100% to the Jedi cause. And Luke listens to this and he's empathetic about this. But ultimately, by the end of the novel, Mara not only does she commit to Luke Skywalker, but she commits to the Jedi Order. And again, the main purpose is that Luke and Mara Jade are trying to infiltrate this hidden fortress, the Hand of Thrawn, where Thrawn's most basically fanatical followers await his call to arms. And Luke and Mara gain access to the fortress with the help of the Quam K, basically aliens that communicate through the Force. And they find out that Thrawn and Palpatine led an expedition at the unknown regions for the Empire. And later on in the story, we find out why. Why was this expedition led? And it's really, really, really fascinating. And I love how all these little details tie to the grander picture that is the expanded universe, that is Star Wars Legends now, because all these little details they connect. And what am I talking about? I'm basically talking about that there's this inference that the Empire knew that there was a bigger threat out there in the galaxy. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the Yuzon Vong. And we'll get to that later. Now, Mara, she encounters a character named Park, who is basically the admiral that was exiled to the unknown regions with Thrawn that mysteriously disappeared earlier on, that was basically uh, talked about earlier on in the novel by Tears. And when Mara encounters Park, he's accompanied by numerous Chiss, who are the same alien species as Admiral Thrawn. And here we recount the outbound flight story. And again, it's really fascinating how Timothy Zahn ties his work all together. And here, Zuntir Fel is also present, who also disappeared mysteriously. And remember that there's these clones of Zuntir Fel running around the galaxy that were created by Thrawn. Now, Fel was recaptured by Izard and sent to Grand Admiral Thrawn's base. And there, Thrawn, he basically showed Fel the threats, the numerous threats that basically await the galaxy in the unknown regions. And as a result of this, Zuntir Fel decide to serve Thrawn's empire. So basically, Thrawn showed Fel that there's all these threats out there beyond the knowledge of the New Republic, the Empire, whatever, and he agreed to serve Thrawn. Now, some of these threats are warlords and other things like that, but I strongly believe that it is inferred that the Yuzon Vong are this ultimate threat. And if you read Outbound Flight, it's fully revealed that Palpatine knew about the Vong and that was his main purpose for working, doing all this conspiring and preparation in the unknown regions, was to prepare for this force that he knew existed. And it's really fascinating how the legends or expanded universe all tie together. And I love how it makes Palpatine and Thrawn seem like, we know that they're evil, but it seems like there's a little bit of an intent there to do good, even though it's evil. We know that they're evil, especially Palpatine, but they're trying to protect the Empire, in other words. But I know Palpatine just cares about his own personal gains. But Thrawn and Zun they really believe that they're protecting citizens of the Empire of the New Republic. So that's really fascinating stuff. And I really believe that when the book talks about these unknown threats that exist in the unknown regions, because the book doesn't fully come out and say who it is, I really believe that Timothy Zahn is inferring that the Yuzon Vaughn exist out there. Now, yes, this book was written I think about a good 5 years maybe before the Vong were even introduced into the expanded universe. I believe this book was written in the late 90s, like 1998, maybe 1997 or something like that. But, you know, I really believe that Lucasfilm, they were planning. They were planning big things. And one thing about the Hand of Thrawn duology was that this book wrapped up a lot of loose ends in the Bantam era expanded universe novels. As much as I love the Bantam era of expanded universe Star Wars novels, one of the main problems a lot of people had were some of these loose ends and some of the overuse of doomsday weapons and things like that. And this book tied up a lot of loose ends and opened up a whole new world of possibilities because ultimately, when this book ends, the Empire and the New Republic have made peace. So whatever comes after these are going to be new threats to the galaxy, to the Star Wars galaxy. It's no longer going to be about the Empire versus the New Republic over and over and over again for the next 20 novels. It's all about new stuff after this. And that was really fascinating. And I really love how this book tied up those loose ends and basically opened up a whole new chapter in the expanded universe or a whole new era, so to speak. Now, one last thing to note in regards to this point in the story. One thing after revealing all this to Mara and Luke is that they fear that the Hand of Thrawn will be given to the Empire by the Chiss, and that's their number one concern upon learning that the Hand of Thrawn exists. So that kind of creates a little bit of tension and suspense at this point in the book. Now, Shada Dukal basically slips from her room while she's on Exocron and basically goes to George Cardas's huge data library, hoping to find basically records that would help identify who was responsible for the destruction of her homeworld, Emberline. Now, when she goes there, she encounters George Cardass, who basically informs her that her world was destroyed by a mercenary force as a result of her planet's war of conquest, which basically turns Shada's world upside down, and she refuses to believe that her homeworld were conquerors. She refuses to believe that her planet were conquerors and that basically a mercenary force destroyed them in an act of retaliation because of terrible things her planet did. Now, George offers her a choice between two data cards, one that would identify the destroyers of her world, and another data card that would end the Kamas incident or all this stuff that's going on in regards to the Kamas document. And possibly this data card could prevent a civil war within the New Republic. And she decides to choose the the data card rather, relating to the Kamas crisis because she feels that learning about who is responsible for her planet's destruction or the destruction of her homeworld is not going to bring her peace. It's just going to be more revenge and more hatred. So she decides to choose to resolve the Kamas crisis. And this is ultimately her giving up her last chance to be reinstated with the Mistral Shadow Guard, because she was hoping that if she found out who was responsible for her planet's destruction, maybe this would allow the Mistral to allow her to come back into the fold. Now, Cardis, he's unable to locate a copy of the Kamas document, because you have to remember that's the whole point of Talon Card and Shada even going to Exocron to find George, was because they thought that he had a copy of the Kamas document, and he does not. However, what he does have is important information that he wants them to give to Admiral Palion. Now, this information is related to Tierce and Disra and the con man Flim, who's pretending to be Grand Admiral Thrawn. And he basically says, give this to Palion, and he will know what to do with it. And this will help prevent a civil war within the New Republic. So Talon and Shada take that data card, and they go to do just that. Now, while that goes down, Mara Jade kamikazes her ship into the hand of Thrawn, and they infiltrate the base. Luke and Mara, they infiltrate the fortress, and there they find a clone of Grand Admiral Thrawn. And I thought this was an awesome scene. It was a great build-up because it shows that Thrawn was this huge mastermind. He's putting all these plots into motions years before he died, and even though he passed away, all these plots are still moving forward to help achieve victory for the Empire. And he even went so far as to create a clone for himself. Now, the clone wasn't fully ready yet, it wasn't fully matured. And battle droids come out of nowhere and battle Luke and Mara. And while Luke and Mara destroy the battle droids, I guess you want to say the collateral damage of their fight causes the clone chamber to flood. And as a result of this, this destroys the clone cylinder that held the Thrawn clones. So the clone of Thrawn is destroyed, and we don't have to worry about that. And while this goes down, R2D2 is able to download a genuine copy of the Kamas document. And together they escape the planet, Mara, Luke, and R2, and they have to, and then, the sense of urgency created around this Kamas document, they want to bring it back in order to resolve this war that's about to go down, this civil war within the New Republic that Imperials, Disra, and Tierce are about to take full advantage of. Now, when Imperial saboteurs, who are basically Navet, they destroy the planet's shields on Bothawi, an armed conflict begins. So basically, civil war has erupted as a result of all the tension involving the Kamas incident. And Han Solo, who is present in orbit, he basically discovers that there's Star Destroyers orbiting nearby. And he basically views them as a greater threat, and he gathers some ships, and they go and basically defeat these Star Destroyers. Now, at Yaga Minor, the New Republic ship, the Errant Venture, appears to be doomed at the hands of the Imperials when help arrives unexpectedly by Admiral Pelion, who at this point in the story, because of the knowledge given to him by Talon Card and Shada, and also the documents that he stole behind Disra's back, is fully aware of Disra's betrayal. And he basically, at this point, publicly exposes that Admiral Thrawn is a fake and that Disra is a traitor. And he also exposes Tierce as a clone of the original Tierce. And that he reveals that this clone was grown by Thrawn 10 years before, and that this guy altered copies of the Kamas document in order to spread growing resentment between the Bothans and to take advantage of this and exploit all this confusion and chaos within the New Republic. in order to use this as an excuse for the Imperials to attack the New Republic while they are at civil war and are weak. It's also at this point in the story that Tierce is killed by Shada Dukal, and Disra is ultimately arrested by Imperials, and Flim, he basically puts on one last performance as Thrawn, and what he does is that he orders all Imperial forces to stand down and basically sends out a call to Bel Iblis of the New Republic to also do so. And this ultimately brings an end to the crisis. And then weeks later, with the copy of the Kamas document that was retrieved by R2, Luke, and Mara, the Palian Gavrisum Treaty is signed. And this brings an official end to the Galactic Civil War that has been going on for so long. Really. And in regards to the Kamas document, because of the long natural lifespan of the Bothans, most of the original saboteurs who were identified by the document and who were responsible for the massacre are still alive. And they are promptly arrested and put on trial. And yes, Mara Jade and Luke Skywalker, they get married. And that basically ties up the end of this book. And I give this book a B plus, a solid B plus. It was an enjoyable read. Timothy Zahn is a master at making us feel like we're in the same galaxy as the original trilogy. He knows the tone of the original trilogy, and he is excellent at the details, and he's great with the characters. He knows Luke, he knows Han, he knows Leia. He does an outstanding job. I love the way he writes. However, his strength is also a little bit of his weakness. Sometimes he could come across as a little superfluous, and sometimes you feel like there's too much details, and I really feel like there was too many characters in the book. Unnecessary characters were introduced, and they really don't contribute much at the end. However, it does not ruin the book at all. I still give it a solid B plus and highly recommend it, especially if you are a fan of Timothy Zahn and the original trilogy. Thank you guys for listening to this review and in-depth analysis. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share. May the force be with you. And last but not least, one love, people. Take care.